Hi, and welcome to lesson 5 of Unit 2 as we're talking through the Spirit's mission of peace. Today's lesson is specifically on a new community of believers. It's lesson 5. I'm Megan Westra. I'm an author and a high school teacher based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I will let you introduce yourself. I'm here with Benjamin Bixler.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm a PhD student at Drew Theological School and also teaching high school at Eastern Mennonite School based in Harrisonburg, Virginia right now.
Cool. So as we turn our attention to this next lesson, picking up on a new month with you all in this community, those who are watching in this class, we're grounding ourselves in this idea of holding things in common as we continue to work our way through Acts chapter 2. And I'm just curious, I would love to hear, Benjamin, how you're coming to this. I get really excited when we turn our attention to the idea of holding things in common. I lived in community for a little while. And so I would love for us to just kind of acknowledge how we're coming to this conversation. And then for those who are in the class, if this kind of sparks something in you, maybe you pause the video for a minute, kind of talk about how you're coming to this conversation. Because when we start talking about economics and money and resources, often that makes us a little bit more uncomfortable or sensitive. It brings a lot of things to the front for us.
Yeah, I mean, I get really excited about this. I actually have taught this passage this past year in my course. And to me, it was one of the most sort of exciting pieces of the course, because I think it was the first chance that some of these students that were in my class really saw sort of a radical new way of the possibilities of what it looks like to live outside of sort of the systems that we're used to. So I get really excited because it presents this new vision for the ways we can be in there, or at least one possible vision for a way that we can be in the world that sort of are different than what we maybe are used to. So that's I bring a lot of energy and excitement to it as well, just because it's something new.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad that we can kind of match energy then. That's exciting. I think both, I lived in community, like I said, it was like 10 years.
Wow.
Here in Milwaukee. And so that was really, we didn't hold all things in common, but there was a lot of shared life. And in some ways, I agree with you that it is kind of a new way of thinking about things. In some ways, I also feel like it's an old way of thinking about things. I grew up in rural Appalachia, so not quite Harrisonburg, but definitely like southwestern Virginia.
Yeah.
And grew up really close to my grandparents, to my great-grandparents, like physically proximate to them.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, that was also a very like communal way of living. And that obviously was like tied through like biology. But the idea that like one person had a tool and everybody just used it when they needed it, or my great-grandmother for the first few years of my life still gardened a lot. And so it was like, well, if we needed like lettuce, we would just go get it out of Mama's garden. And so in some ways there's this like toggling for me in the conversation between this like really new idea that subverts a lot of systems and a weird sort of like homecoming of like, oh wait, how did communities function and live and work a long time ago? Before it was just like, well, if I need a tool, I have to go buy it myself. Or if I need lettuce, I go to the store and hope that it's not like contaminated with E. coli. So it feels like there's both this like new way emerging and also something that maybe we forgot along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. And like, as I was thinking through this too, like I've never done intentional community in the way that you've described, but at the same time, like my wife was a residence director when I was in seminary. And so like we had that sort of college dorm experience. And then also the RDs all got together for meals occasionally. And so it wasn't intentional in the same way, but it was these built-in communities. And then again, my wife went to seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. And so we ended up living in sort of their institutional housing, but that really became a community in the sense that we shared childcare with each other, in the sense that they had this little pavilion area where we would all grill together. And so like, now that we're sort of on our own in this single family dwelling, like I actually miss a lot of some of those pieces that we used to have, where your life is just more integrated with other people, and you're not just sort of on an island by yourself, which is what I'm sensing a little bit here as we've recently moved into a new stage as a family coming out of grad school. Like I wasn't expecting to find that in grad school, but those sort of built-in communities where you're living together. Yeah, there's really just something energizing about that. And yeah, it's maybe, I like the way you phrased it. It's not new. It's a return to these ways that communities used to be, at least for those of us living in sort of Western, especially North American 21st century, highly individualistic cultures. Yeah, there's just a lot there that maybe we could recover from other ways of being. And so, yeah, like in the lesson, like one of the questions that asked was like, when was the last time you shared a meal with someone? And I realized that with COVID, that gets really complicated and everything else. But yeah, like that's one of the pieces that I miss from previous experiences, is that idea that we don't share meals as often as we used to. For me personally, as a family. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that became really important for us as our family transitioned out of living in community. That was something that we intentionally like built in with the people that we had lived in community with for a year and a half during COVID, even to say, we are still going to meet you for dinner we did it every Sunday night for a year and a half. We bundled up, we were eating outside, like across we were like 12 feet away from each other. And into the winter and through the winter. And I'm in Wisconsin, so I think the coldest outside it got, we missed a couple weeks when it was just unbearable. But there were weeks where we were bundled up, had a big fire pit between us, and it was like 18 degrees outside. And we were just like, no, we're gonna do this. We have to see each other. We have to share a meal. And it feels bananas to talk about it now. Like that was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And also, I think that I have learned over time to value community in such a way where it's just like, no, it is more important to my spiritual well-being and what God is doing in the world that I bundle up and eat outside in 18-degree weather than it is for me to be alone. And I think that that's something that if we think about, I like to think about spiritual life in terms of like strength and atrophy, like our muscles, because that kind of takes away like some of the like good, bad that I feel like is really hard to navigate sometimes. There's a lot of judgment associated with that. Instead of just like, well, if something is atrophied, then it can become strong again. Like it takes time. And I think when I consider how I grew up and the spiritual formation I received growing up, it was so individualized. It was so like focused on like you and your daily quiet time. And there wasn't a question of like, when did you share a meal with somebody? That wasn't part of like your household, however you define that. And so I think for me, like that has become such a strong part, right? That is no longer atrophied for me. That has become a strong part of my spiritual practice of like, are there people physically like proximate to me around a table, usually still outside at this point. But however I'm navigating that within the context of the pandemic, there were times where we set up the Zoom meeting and like had people at our table over Zoom. And so I think if I can encourage like people in the class to think about that too, that such a good question in the lesson of like, when did you last share a meal with people? And to think about that as broadly as you can, given the circumstances of the world right now. Are you finding ways to kind of have this openness to others, this generosity of presence and of resource, even in these times where being physically proximate to each other remains this like really weird question that we're all having to navigate.
No, and I think that that's really good because we are sort of renegotiating some of this, whether it's like work from home kinds of things or whatever. And that was one of the things that really struck me in this Acts passage, is that it says like every day they were meeting together in the temple to worship, and then they were sharing, like it's a daily practice kind of thing. And we live in a very different cultural context, obviously, but how do we sort of yeah, whether it's Zoom meals or what, like, how do we replicate that kind of community and togetherness? I really like the way you said, like, you didn't want to be alone. And I think there's something really in this passage about how powerful it is for communities to develop sort of these practices that keep them engaged with each other, and we're not just off by ourselves, but we're hearing the voices of other people, we're in conversation with people, we're interacting with them, and yeah, we're feeding off of their energy and the ways that they function as well. And so to me, that's what I always found really powerful about teaching in Acts chapter 2 to these students. And one of the activities that I enjoyed doing with them was having them look up, like, what are other models for intentional communities? What do they look like? And so, if you're looking for things to do in the class, I think you could look at things like Reba Place in Chicago, which is a Mennonite-centric group. Like Simple Way in Chicago is another kind of, or not Chicago, in Philly is kind of another famous one. Koinonia Farm is one that I think it's Clarence Jordan did in Georgia, which is a very different model than the urban context. And so when students looked at that, it really presented multiple ways to think about doing this, rather than just a prescriptive sort of like, this is how intentional community has to look, to make it fit for wherever you're at. So yeah, so that would be one activity that I would throw out there for anyone doing the class if they're looking for something.
I love that. And I think the more we're exposed to these different types of doing things, whether it's Reba Place or Simple Way or Koinonia Farms, who they grow the best dang pecans I've ever had in my life. They're so good. But if you, as we look at these different things, it's a reforming of our imagination too.
Yeah.
And I love Dr. Willie Jennings did a beautiful commentary on Acts. So I feel like I should just preface anything intelligent I say about the book of Acts probably came from Dr. Willie Jennings first. But I love how his other book, or one of his other books, Christian Imagination, like so much of our discipleship, particularly for those of us in contexts that have been heavily influenced and shaped by the lie of white supremacy, which is anybody that lives in the United States. But so much of our spiritual practice is also this liberating of the imagination, this reimagining what is possible. And so even though my intentional community experience was very different than the Simple Way or Reba House or any of that, that those all influenced what we brought into that space. We looked at those things and we said, okay, what do we feel works in our context? What doesn't? And then again, when I transitioned out of living in an intentional community, it became this question of like, okay, what do we carry forward with us? These Sunday night dinners, the way that we orient now to our neighbors. When we were moving out of community, our daughter was 8 at the time. And we would go and we would look at houses and things like that. And she would ask sometimes, she's like, does just one family live here? Will we live here by ourselves? Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a profound way to be growing up and orienting yourself in the world where your automatic isn't, this is the single family home. But you ask the question wow, there's a lot of space in this house. Does just one family live here? Is it just going to be one? And so I think to start to approach our lives with that question of, is this just a one person or one family or one household thing? Or how do we hold more in common? What becomes the open part of our household or the open part of our lives? And how do we move toward an imagination of commonality instead of an imagination of privatization?
Yeah, no, that's great. And the other thing that really struck me in reading through the lesson and in reading that I always have been struck by in Acts chapter 2 here is the way that, again, it's not meant to be prescriptive, but rather it's descriptive. And so to reimagine new imaginations, whether it's the lesson talks about economic justice. And so does economic justice only happen with those people we're closest to that we live in community with? Or can we begin to think more broadly about, what does communal repentance look like? What does communal justice look like? And the author mentions her one line in there that really struck me in the lesson was that economic justice has to be tied to racial justice issues. So you named Willie James Jennings. And so, yeah, to build off of his work and his ideas about how do we think about making a more just society in economic terms, and what all plays into that. And racial justice is one of those things. The lesson doesn't really delve into that, but I think that could be a place that if you're facilitating this group, you could definitely find some resources to dive into those questions. And for me, I've always drawn it back to peace is our overall theme, and shalom. And that Hebrew term is a very rich term that talks about repair and repentance. And so how do we think about things like economic justice in terms of repair and rebuilding things that have been broken for others? Not just, so it's not just this sort of self-serving communal goods, but rather it's how broadly can we envision this common good that we're working towards?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that line as well, and that
Yeah.
she kind of brings everything down to like, we cannot separate these things.
Yeah.
And so, I think a lot about like, it's good to have these small imaginings and these small practices like a Sunday night dinner,
Yeah.
but only in as much as they serve to like strengthen that muscle of like these
Yeah.
bigger lifts and these bigger imagination shifts that we need to have. And making sure that we're constantly holding all of that together, that it's
Yeah.
not just a personal practice, that it's not
Yeah.
just a, for me and my community, or me and my church, or me and my family.
Mhm.
And that fracturing is one of the fundamental, I would call it sin, like that's like
Yeah.
the fundamental sin at the heart of so much of this,
Yeah.
is saying that we can have personal flourishing or private flourishing apart from
Yeah.
this like greater common good and beloved community,
Mhm.
or even more sinisterly, that the common, or that the good of my personal family could be built on the intentional fracturing and subjugation of someone else, which is my story as a
Yeah.
white woman who grew up in the South in the United States. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, I think as we think about this, like wrapping up here, but like to the ways in which this builds from sort of this small group outward. And so we're all interconnected. And so I think this is one chapter, Acts chapter 2 here, that really pushes us to be able to see some of those systems that end up undergirding things. So yeah, so hopefully as you prepare for this lesson, this gives you some good ideas and some places to start. We'll see you next week.